Hey everyone, today we are going to talk about asset loading in React. This is a new feature that's coming to React 19, but if you're using server components, you get to use this feature today. So let's dive in and let's take a look at this little alert component that we have right here. This alert box is rendered by this component right here. You can see on the first line, we load this style sheet. That's this style sheet down here. This provides all of the styles for our alert box. And then very next line of our component, we render a div with my alert box class and a message that says this should be read. And when we reload the page, we can see that everything just works. Now, there's something special I have about this server that serves our CSS. I can come over here and I can add a query param called delay. And that is going to allow me to delay the loading of this style sheet by a second. And then now if we reload, we get this flash of unstyled content because our component is rendering and the CSS doesn't load for another second. So our component renders, there's no myAlertBox class to style this component. And then when the CSS loads, our styling kicks in and you get this, this really ugly flash of unstyled content. Now, it's worth pointing out that if we were rendering HTML to the browser, if we were sending HTML to a browser, and the browser came across a link tag that loaded a style sheet, the browser would stop rendering the page and it would wait for that style sheet to load, and only then would it continue rendering the rest of the page. But here, we're not rendering HTML. We're using React to insert these elements into the DOM, so there's no real safe way to do render blocking. And this is where asset loading in React comes in. And the way that we use asset loading with the style sheet is by providing it a tag called precedence. We're going to pass precedence with a value of high. And then now, when we load our page, you're going to see that React is going to render nothing until the CSS is loaded. So we're going to reload, we get a white screen, and then only once the CSS file is loaded do we paint the component, so we avoid that flash of unstyled content. Now, precedence is the only prop we need with a style sheet to opt in to asset loading. And the values for precedence can be high, low, medium, or reset. And the reason you need these values is because the load order of CSS matters. So we need to tell React, if we're loading multiple style sheets, which style sheet is most important, which style sheets are least important. And so we can use, high to signify that this is an important style sheet. And if there's ever conflicting styles, this one will load last, so its styles win. Okay, now another interesting thing about asset loading is where React inserts this element into the DOM. Let's go ahead and let's just inspect our page. And you're going to see, we see the div that renders our alert box, but we don't see the link tag. And that's because when React comes across a link tag with precedence, it is not going to render it in line in the component. Instead, it is going to hoist it up to the head of our page. And this is cool because CSS belongs in the head. It is generally a resource that is going to affect the entire document. So we want it hoisted up and rendered up in the head. Just to show you what it looks like without precedence, if we reload now, you're going to see that our link tag is now inserted in line in the component, because without precedence, we're telling React, hey, we got this link tag, we're going to handle it. But once we use precedence, we're going to delegate all of the loading to React. Now, the next thing to know about asset loading is that React is going to use suspense to suspend our component while the assets are loading. So this component right here is going to enter a suspended state for a second while that CSS is being loaded. Once the CSS is loaded, our component unsuspends and React commits it to the screen. And I think suspense is one of the coolest features of React. I think suspense is so cool because of how it works, how it composes with the rest of our application. And to show you that, I've got this other app over here. This is a book app. It just renders a bunch of books. And one of the things you can see, let's click over to Dune. Each book is going to have its own custom theme, its own style sheet. So with Dune, I tried to do like the planet down here, and then we've got this riff of space, and then we've kind of got this this spice up here floating in space. It's pretty fun to use CSS to give each book, its own little theme. With recursion, this page is going to start off in color, and then it's going to slowly render between color and black and white. Now, one thing you might have noticed here is that when I click into a book, we render the book, and the page is white. And then, a second later, the CSS loads and restyles the page. And that's kind of a jarring user experience. It's especially with Snow Crash. Let's click in here. We get the render, CSS loads, kicks off a bunch of animations, and just, really, really jarring UX. Let's take a look at how we built this app. This is a page right here that renders each book. And you can see right at the top of the page, we are loading the book style sheet. And again, we have this delay prop to kind of slow things down, but we are only rendering a book's style sheet when we render that book. Because each book has its own styles, we don't want to just render all the style sheets up front. We only want to render them when you navigate to a book page. You could imagine we've got thousands of books. That would be a lot of CSS, a lot of unnecessary CSS to load. So we're going to wait to the last possible minute before rendering that CSS. Let's take a look at one of these CSS files. Let's pop open Snow Crash. You can see there's not really a lot of CSS here, just kind of like some custom animations that allow us to control, the styling and the theme on the page. But the problem is that we get this flash of unstyled content while we're waiting for our CSS to load. So like before, we are going to use precedence to signal to React that it cannot render this page until the CSS is loaded. Let's refresh our app here. And then now as we click into each book, you'll notice we don't actually move to that book screen until the CSS is loaded. There is no more flash of unstyled content. And the user experience is just a lot better here. Now let's go look at how we build this bookshelf up here, how we build all the links to these books. Somewhere in this app, I've got a bookshelf component. And bookshelf is just going to loop over all of our books, render a link tag. And down here, we do the image, and we've got some like fancy tailwind to take care of this like scale out, this pop out animation. But for the most part here, we are just looping over a list of books and rendering links. Now there's something special about this link tag. We have an on click that calls navigate to book. And if we look at navigate to book is going to start a transition, and then it's going to navigate to that book page. And the way transitions work, if you've never used transitions in React, the way that transitions work is they tell React, hey, we'd like to move into this new state. In our case, we would like to navigate to this new book page, but we don't want to instantly navigate there. We want to make sure that React has everything it needs in order to render that next state, that next page in our case. And so we're willing to just sit around and wait and look at the old UI while React is preparing the next screen. And then only once React has everything it needs to render, then React should render, and we want to see that page. So in our case, what does it mean to have everything to render? Well, if we take a look at our book page, we first need to fetch the book from the database, and then we need to load the book's CSS. So by using all of these features in React that trigger suspense, we are able for our component to communicate out when it's ready to render. And I think this is really cool. It's kind of subtle, but I think it's really cool that the bookshelf can just say, hey, I'd like to navigate to a new book. The bookshelf doesn't know what work React needs to do. It's up to the actual individual book page to decide what work needs to be done. So this lets you keep all of your data loading requirements in a component that actually needs that data. And then other components in our application that want to render this page can just rely on transitions to safely transition to them. I think this is one of the coolest features of React, that we can just keep all data fetching and all data loading requirements within the component, and we're just going to rely on suspense. Okay, there is one more thing about asset loading with style sheets that I want to show you, and that is whenever we load a style sheet. So if we look down here where React rendered all of our style sheets, it's important to know that when React renders a CSS file, it is not going to unmount it when you navigate away from the page. There's a few reasons for that. One being that when you unload CSS, you force the page to recalculate all of its styles. So that could make your navigations really expensive if they're causing CSS to be unloaded. So React made the decision to keep these style sheets rendered for longer than the components are going to exist on the screen, which means you have to be careful about your class names. Because if you have generic class names that conflict, well, you might navigate away from the page, but that page's styles would still be loaded and they could conflict with styles on another page. So this asset loading works best with CSS that is, you can think of as like side effect free. Something like CSS that's scoped. So if you're using CSS modules, I think it automatically does that. Personally, I use Tailwind. So Tailwind is safe in this sort of system, any atomic CSS, because the class BG Blue 500 is always going to mean background blue 500. It's never going to conflict with another class. But that's an important thing to know, that your style sheets are going to live longer than your components that render them. But a cool thing about that, it means that once we have navigated to a book, the next navigation to that book is going to be instant. So we don't have to wait for React to reload the style sheet. We only have to wait if we're visiting a book for the first time. So I hope you learned something about asset loading in React today. I hope you found this video helpful, and I'll see you in the next one.